It was an ordinary Tuesday night when 9-year-old Emma Reynolds stepped onto the stage of Nashville's Municipal Theater. She was no different from any other child you know. She wore a simple white t-shirt, worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her blonde hair was tied in a slightly crooked ponytail, which she had styled herself while waiting backstage. There was no glamour, no professional preparation, no team of stylists. It was just Emma, with her voice and a truth that burned in her heart. The talent show host, Richard Chambers, was known throughout the country. He had an overly wide smile, overly white teeth, and a blue suit covered in silver stars that glittered under the spotlights. 45 years in television had made him an institution. Everyone knew Richard. Everyone loved Richard. He was the man who turned dreams into reality, who discovered talent, who made stars rise overnight. At least, that's what they said. That night was being recorded for national broadcast. The cameras captured every angle, every expression, every tear of emotion that streamed down the faces of the participants. The audience was completely packed. More than 2,000 seats were occupied by people who had waited months for that ticket. They laughed when Richard made a joke, applauded when he asked, sighed when he created a dramatic moment. It was a perfectly well-oiled entertainment machine. Emma hadn't planned on participating in the program. In fact, she was there because of her music teacher, Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 60s who believed the girl had something special. For months, Mrs. Patterson had been insisting. She had filled out the application, recorded the audition video, sent the documents, all without Emma truly believing anything would happen. But the phone call came, and there she was, trembling backstage as she heard her name being called. As Emma walked to the center of the stage, she felt the weight of thousands of eyes upon her. The lights were so bright she could barely see beyond the first few rows. The heat was intense. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it echoing in her ears. Richard approached with his microphone, grinning that famous smile, and began asking the usual questions. Where are you from, Emma? How did you discover you liked to sing? Who are your biggest inspirations? The questions were designed to create a sweet moment, something the editors could use to build a compelling narrative. But Emma answered briefly, directly, almost uncomfortably. She wasn't interested in telling a sad story to gain sympathy. She hadn't lost a loved one. Her parents weren't poor or ill. She was just a girl who liked to sing and who had something to say. Richard realized he wasn't able to extract the emotional gold he usually found. So he did what he always did in these cases. He hurried the interview and asked her to start singing. The orchestra was ready, the musicians holding their instruments, waiting for the signal. But Emma delicately raised her hand and said something that made Richard frown. She wanted to sing unaccompanied, just her voice, nothing else. There was an awkward pause. Richard glanced at the producers in the shadows on the sides of the stage. This wasn't in the script. A cappella performances were rare, risky, but the audience was already expecting it. The cameras were rolling, and refusing a 9-year-old's request live on air would be terrible for the image. So, Richard smiled again, took a step back, and extended his arm as if giving him permission to proceed. Emma closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, and when she opened her mouth, what came out wasn't a well-known hit song. It wasn't a popular ballad everyone expected to hear. It was a song she had written herself, with words that cut like razors. The melody was simple, but laden with a sadness too mature for her age. And the lyrics, every word of the lyrics was like a punch to the gut for anyone who actually stopped to listen. She sang about masks, about people who smile while they destroy, about bright lights that blind the truth, about powerful men who build empires on the backs of the small and the forgotten, about how everyone applauds the show while the theater is on fire. Emma's voice was crystal clear, in tune, impossible to ignore, and the words were impossible not to understand. At first, the audience didn't know how to react. Some continued smiling, hoping it was part of some artistic performance they didn't fully understand. Others began exchanging uncomfortable glances. Richard remained by the side of the stage, his smile now seeming glued to his face, forced, almost painful to maintain. He couldn't interrupt her, not live on air, but he also didn't like where this was going. When Emma reached the chorus, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Richard. It wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Every word that came out of her mouth at that moment was directed at him. She sang about false stars, about men who make children dream only to shatter their dreams afterward, about empty promises and applause that means nothing. And then, in the quietest moment of the song, she said a name. She didn't sing it. She said it, clearly. A girl's name, Sarah Mitchell, 15 years old. She had participated in that same program 3 years earlier. She had reached the final, won millions of hearts, signed an exclusive contract with Richard's production company. For 6 months, her face was everywhere. And then, suddenly, she disappeared. No music releases, no public appearances, just silence. Rumors circulated in the dark corners of the internet, but nothing concrete, nothing that could be proven. Sarah had tried to speak, but lawyers had ensured her voice was silenced with confidentiality agreements and legal threats. Emma had met Sarah. They had met at a charity event a few months ago. Sarah was different, older than she should look. Her eyes were empty. She had told Emma what really went on behind the scenes of that glittering world. The long hours of filming without proper rest, the contracts that stole all the money, the broken promises, and worse, much worse, the situations she had been put in. Situations no child should ever have to experience, with powerful men who knew exactly how to use their power. Emma hadn't planned to do that, but when she was backstage, watching Richard ask his manipulative questions, creating his fake moments of emotion, something inside her broke. She thought of Sarah. She thought of how many other Sarahs there were. She thought of how everyone applauded while it was happening, blind or indifferent, as long as the entertainment continued. The reaction was immediate. Some in the audience began to boo. Others stood in shocked silence. The producers rushed to the technical controls, shouting contradictory orders. Should they cut the transmission? Let it play and deal with the consequences. Later, Richard tried to approach, but Emma continued singing, her voice growing stronger, clearer, filling every inch of that theater. When she finally finished, the silence was deafening. There was no applause, no shouts of approval, just a heavy, uncomfortable emptiness. Emma opened her eyes wide and looked at the audience. She saw mothers holding their daughters a little tighter. She saw men averting their gaze. She saw the stark truth reflected in thousands of faces that didn't know how to process what they had just witnessed. Richard finally regained his professional composure. He approached, placed his hand on Emma's shoulder with a little more force than necessary, and began speaking rapidly to the cameras. He thanked Emma for her participation, said something vague about daring performances and expressive youth, and quickly led her off stage while signaling for the orchestra to start playing something, anything, to fill the void. Backstage, Emma was immediately surrounded. Producers, assistants, security guards, all talking at once. Some seemed angry, others seemed frightened. No one seemed to know exactly what to do. Mrs. Patterson managed to reach Emma, placing herself between the girl and the crowd of agitated adults. She held Emma's hand firmly and led her out of the theater through the back exit, ignoring the voices shouting for them to wait, that there were documents to sign, legal matters to resolve. In the following hours, the internet exploded. The video of Emma's performance was cut from the official broadcast, but dozens of people in the audience had recorded it with their cell phones. Within minutes, it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. There was no stopping it. People shared, commented, debated. Some said Emma was a hero. Others called her a manipulated liar. Some demanded investigations. Others defended Richard as a family man who would never harm anyone. Sarah Mitchell saw the video. She was in her small apartment, away from the spotlight, working a regular job to pay her bills. When she watched Emma singing, saying her name, bringing her story to light, something inside her broke and rebuilt itself at the same time. She cried. She cried like she hadn't cried in years. And then, for the first time in 3 years, she decided to speak again. This time, she didn't care about the lawyers or the threats. She recorded a video, posted it on her social media, and told everything. Others began to emerge. Not just from Richard's show, but from across the industry. Girls and boys who had been promised stardom, and who instead received trauma and silence. The stories were eerily similar. Abusive contracts, long hours, inadequate environments, and in some cases, far worse things that warranted serious criminal investigations. Richard Chambers denied everything. His public relations team worked day and night. They attacked Emma's credibility. They said she had been manipulated by adults with political agendas, They hired experts to analyze the song lyrics and argue that they were too complex for a 9-year-old to have written alone. They tried to portray Sarah and the others as opportunists seeking attention and money. It was an old strategy, but often effective. But this time it was different. Perhaps because the movement had been growing for years. Perhaps because people were tired of seeing powerful people get away with it. Perhaps because the image of a little girl, trembling, on stage, telling the truth to millions, was impossible to ignore. Investigations were opened. Journalists began digging deep. Documents leaked. Internal emails showed that many people knew about many things and had done nothing. Emma and her family had to move temporarily. The threats were constant. People showed up at her house. Her phone number was leaked. Lawyers sent intimidating letters. But Mrs. Patterson stood by them, as did other teachers, neighbors, and ordinary people who believed that this child deserved to be protected for having had courage when many adults did not. 6 months later, Richard Chambers resigned from the program. It wasn't a voluntary choice, but it was presented that way to save face. Some formal charges were filed, although many were settled out of court with financial settlements and further confidentiality clauses. The program continued with a new host, new producers, and new child protection policies. They tried to reinvent themselves as advocates for children's rights, which many saw as cynical opportunism. Emma never sang in public again. She received offers, many offers, from record labels, producers, even from Richard's rivals who wanted to capitalize on her fame. But she refused them all. She had said what she needed to say. She had used her voice in the only way that mattered to her. To continue in that world, even with good intentions, seemed like a betrayal of her original purpose. Sarah Mitchell began studying law. She wanted to specialize in entertainment contracts involving minors. She wanted to use what she had learned the hard way to protect others from going through the same thing. She and Emma stayed in touch. They weren't exactly friends in the traditional sense. There was an age difference, a difference in experiences, but there was a deep understanding between them, a connection formed through shared courage and invisible scars. Years later, when Emma was in high school, she wrote an essay for her English class about that night, not for publication or to earn points, just to process, to understand what had happened and why she had done what she did. She wrote about the fear she felt, about how her voice trembled on the first few notes, about how she almost stopped several times. But she also wrote about Sarah, about how the older girl's empty eyes had haunted her for weeks, about how she couldn't sleep thinking that, while everyone was applauding and smiling, children were suffering backstage. The essay ended with a simple question. How many times do we choose entertainment over truth? How many times do we applaud the show while the theater burns? Her teacher read the essay silently, tears streaming down her face, and simply hugged Emma after class, without saying a word. The truth Emma sang that night wasn't new. Many people already knew it. Journalists had written articles. Activists had protested. But there was something about a child, just one child with a clear voice and simple words that cut through all the layers of denial and rationalization that adults had built up. She forced people to look at something they preferred to ignore, and while many went back to ignoring it after the commotion subsided, some didn't. Some kept fighting. Some changed the system little by little. Emma Reynolds never became a star. Her name isn't on magazine covers. She doesn't have millions of followers. She lives a relatively normal life, except for the fact that occasionally someone recognizes her and thanks her for what she's done. These moments make her uncomfortable. She doesn't feel like a heroine. She was just a girl who sang a song. But for Sarah, and for the others who found courage in her courage, Emma will always be the girl who refused to applaud while the theater burned, who chose the truth when it would have been much easier, safer, more profitable to choose silence. And perhaps that's what true courage means. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to speak, despite it. Not the pursuit of glory, but the willingness to pay the price for truth. Emma paid that price. She lost the innocence of believing the world was just. She carried the weight of attacks and threats. But she also gained something that no amount of money or faith can buy. What more could she buy? The peace of mind of knowing that, when she imported, she made the right choice.